All right, so today we're going global, like really global. You guys wanted us to do a deep dive into what's happening economically and socially in 5 major countries: China, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and the UK.
That's quite the lineup.
Right. And we're not messing around. We've got articles, academic papers, you name it all, to help us untangle this massive web of global change.
It is a pretty fascinating mix of countries. Each one is dealing with globalization in its own way.
So true. Where do we even begin? What jumped out at you from all this material?
Honestly, the thing that struck me the most is how different their approaches are. Some countries are diving headfirst into globalization. Others are, well, trying to control it. And then there are those who, let's just say they're doing their own thing.
Okay, now you've got me intrigued. Let's start with, I guess, a country that seems to be handling globalization pretty well: China.
Yeah, China. Their shift from, Mao Zedong's command economy to what they call market socialism has been, there's no other way to put it, it's been astonishing. They've lifted, think about this, over 850 million people out of poverty. That's more than the entire population of Europe.
Wow, that's almost impossible to grasp. But how did they do it? Going from a completely controlled economy to something more, I don't know, market-driven, that's a huge change.
It is. It really is. And I think a lot of it comes down to this pragmatic approach that Deng Xiaoping, their leader after Mao, really pushed for. He had this famous saying, it doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice.
So basically he was saying, who cares about the ideology, just get results.
Exactly. He was all about effectiveness. And that led to some pretty radical reforms. Farmers were suddenly allowed to sell their extra crops. They created these things called special economic zones, basically. Entire cities designed to pull in foreign investment. And, of course, they opened up to international trade.
Which is how Made in China became, well, Made in China.
Right. For a while there, it felt like everything I owned was made in China.
Yeah, that's globalization in action.
Yeah.
But it hasn't all been sunshine and roses. This crazy fast growth has come with a cost. A widening gap between the rich and poor. Tons of people moving to cities for work, which puts huge pressure on those cities. And of course, you can't forget about the environmental problems. Remember those pictures of Beijing during the Olympics? The smog was unbelievable.
Oh, yeah. You couldn't miss it. That was a pretty stark reminder of what happens when you industrialize that quickly. But I'm curious, for someone who wants to, say, do business with China, how does all this, the economic power, the social issues, the environmental challenges, how does it all factor in?
It's crucial to understand that China is complicated. Dynamic, yes, but with a lot of layers. There's a ton of opportunity there, no doubt, but also a lot of risk. Anyone doing business with China needs to be aware of both sides of that coin. So it's a high-risk, high-reward kind of situation. All right, let's switch gears completely and head south. Mexico has also been massively impacted by globalization, especially after joining NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Oh, yeah. NAFTA was a game changer, no doubt, but it's also been controversial. Some sectors boomed, but others, especially agriculture, saw huge job losses. And then there's the issue of inequality. NAFTA definitely played a role in that.
Right, so it's not just about growth, but also about who benefits from that growth. And I know Mexico has been trying to tackle these issues with programs like Prospera, right?
Exactly. Prospera is what we call a conditional cash transfer program. Basically, families get financial help if they meet certain conditions, like making sure their kids go to school and get regular health checkups.
Yeah.
It's an example of how social policies can try to, cushion the blow from some of these economic changes.
It really shows how intertwined economic and social policy are. You can't separate them. Speaking of intertwined, you know what I found surprising? Mexican immigration to the U.S. has actually been going down an end since 2009. I thought it was still rising.
It's true. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it has been declining.
Yeah.
Probably a mix of things at play there. The 2008 recession in the U.S., stricter border policies, and even changing demographics within Mexico itself.
So Mexico is juggling all these global forces while also dealing with its own internal dynamics. That's quite a balancing act.
It definitely is. And anyone trying to understand Mexico's future needs to understand all of it, not just NAFTA or immigration, but how it all fits together. Domestic politics, social programs, the hopes and fears of the Mexican people. It's a complex picture.
Okay, we've talked about a global powerhouse and a country wrestling with free trade. Now let's hop across the Atlantic to Africa's most populous nation, Nigeria. They've got natural resources galore, especially oil, but it hasn't always been easy.
No, it hasn't. Nigeria is a textbook example of what we call the resource curse. They've got oil, but, well, it's caused a whole bunch of problems for them.
Wait, hold on. How can having too much of something be a bad thing? Explain this resource curse thing to me.
Imagine you're a kid, right? And you've got a jar full of candy. What happens? You're probably going to eat candy all day long and forget about eating your vegetables or going outside to play.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
It's the same idea with countries and resources. They get so focused on exporting that one thing, like oil, that they neglect everything else. Manufacturing, agriculture, you name it, and then they're stuck. If the price of oil drops, their whole economy tanks.
So it's like they're putting all their eggs in one basket and then dropping the basket.
Exactly. And it gets worse, all that wealth from oil. It often leads to corruption. When a few people control something that valuable, well, others want a piece of the pie. And they'll do whatever it takes to get it, even if it hurts the rest of the country.
So even though they have all this oil wealth, it can actually hold them back economically and socially.
That's the crazy thing about the resource curse. It can trap countries in a cycle of dependence, corruption, underdevelopment, even when they're sitting on a gold mine. And Nigeria has definitely experienced its fair share of these challenges.
But here's what I found really interesting. Despite all that, Nigeria is a leader in entrepreneurship. They're facing all these economic hurdles with incredible creativity, especially among young people.
That's what makes Nigeria so fascinating. They're battling this resource curse head-on with this incredible spirit of innovation and self-reliance. They're not just victims of circumstance, they're shaping their own future.
It's really inspiring, honestly. They're turning challenges into opportunities. Okay, we've covered 3 very different countries, each with its own unique set of circumstances. Now, get ready for a slightly more intense leg of our journey. Let's talk about Russia. They're a huge player on the world stage, but also heavily reliant on oil, which, as we've just seen, can be a double-edged sword.
Yeah, Russia. The reliance on natural resources is there too, but with its own twist. It's led to what some call a rentier state mentality.
Rentier state. Okay, gotta admit, I'm not familiar with that one. What does that even mean?
Basically, a rentier state is a country that makes most of its money by, well, renting out its natural resources to other countries, like Russia with its oil. So they're not as reliant on things like taxes from their citizens.
So it's like they're landlords, but for oil. But what's the problem with that? Sounds like easy money.
The problem is it can create a system where the government doesn't really have to answer to its people. If they're not relying on taxes, they're not as motivated to, listen to what the people need or want.
Ah, so it can lead to a less democratic, more authoritarian style of government.
Exactly. And unfortunately, we've seen that play out in Russia. The oil money has concentrated power in the hands of a few, and it's arguably stunted the development of a more, well, diverse and resilient economy.
So on top of the resource curse, they've got this rentier state thing going on. That's
Yeah.
a tough combo.
It is. And then you added another major challenge, demographics. Russia's population is shrinking and aging, which puts a huge strain on things like pensions and healthcare. They even tried to boost birth rates with, get this, a national day of conception.
Wow, okay, that's creative. But it sounds like they're facing some serious headwinds, demographically speaking.
They are. And all of this together, the shrinking population, the dependence on oil, the political landscape, it creates a very volatile and often unpredictable situation,
Yeah.
especially with the war in Ukraine and all the sanctions that have followed. Understanding these vulnerabilities is key to understanding how Russia acts on the world stage.
Okay, Russia is definitely a country with a lot going on and a lot at stake. But we've got one more stop on our global tour, and it's back to Europe, but to a nation going through a pretty major identity crisis right now, the UK.
Yeah, the UK, their decision to leave the European Union, Brexit, has caused a ton of uncertainty economically and politically. And that's had a ripple effect on basically everything.
Brexit has been, well, it's been a wild ride, to say the least. And on top of that, they're dealing with the fallout from the 2008 recession, the pandemic. It's been a rough few years for them.
It has. They've had to make some serious cuts to public spending, what we call austerity measures, to try and get their economy back on track.
But in the midst of all that, they've been very protective of their National Health Service, the NHS. That seems to be a point of national pride for them.
The NHS is their nationalized healthcare system, and it's incredibly popular. But it's also under a lot of financial pressure, especially with the aging population and all the economic challenges we've been talking about.
So it's a tough balancing act, trying to maintain this, well, beloved social safety net, while also dealing with all these bigger economic pressures. It's a real dilemma.
It is. And the choices the UK makes in the next few years, how they balance their economic realities with their commitment to social welfare. It'll be interesting to watch. This struggle between economic pragmatism and maintaining a strong social safety net is something a lot of developed countries are dealing with. The UK's experience could be a valuable lesson for others.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've seen China's economic rise, Mexico's NAFTA struggles, Nigeria's entrepreneurial spirit battling the resource curse, and Russia's unique challenges as a rentier state with a shrinking population. And we've only just scratched the surface of the UK's post-Brexit journey.
It has been quite a whirlwind tour. We've only just begun to unpack the complexities of these five fascinating nations.
Stay tuned for part two, where we'll dive even deeper into these global shifts and explore some of the overarching themes that connect these seemingly disparate countries. Welcome back to our global exploration. We covered a lot of ground in part one, from China's economic rise to Nigeria's entrepreneurial spirit.
It really has been a fascinating journey so far, hasn't it? It shows just how diverse these five countries are, in terms of how they're approaching these global challenges.
Absolutely. And yet, even with all their differences, there are some interesting common threads that have popped up, like the impact of structural adjustment programs. I have to admit, I'm still a little fuzzy on exactly what those are.
Yeah, they can be a little bit complicated. But essentially, structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, as they're often called, are basically conditions that are attached to loans that countries get from international financial institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank.
Okay, so say a country's in a financial crisis. They go to the IMF or the World Bank for help, but it's not just a free handout.
Right. These institutions, they often require countries to implement certain economic policies in exchange for those loans. The goal is to stabilize their economies and, create the conditions for long-term growth.
That sounds reasonable on the surface, but what kind of policies are we talking about here?
Well, it can vary, but it often involves things like cutting government spending, privatizing state-owned industries, reducing tariffs, and devaluing currency. It's all about shifting toward a more market-oriented economy, one that's attractive to foreign investment.
But it sounds like those changes could be pretty disruptive, especially for the people actually living in those countries.
Yeah, there's no doubt that SAPs can have significant social consequences. Critics argue that they often hit the poor and vulnerable the hardest, leading to job losses, cuts to essential social programs, and sometimes even social unrest.
So it's like a trade-off, right? Short-term pain for the hope of long-term gain. But do these programs actually work? Do they deliver on that promise of economic growth?
Hmm. Well, that's a question that economists have been debating for decades. The evidence is mixed, and the outcomes vary a lot depending on the specific context of each country. Some countries have seen positive results, while others have experienced negative consequences that outweigh any potential benefits.
So there's no easy answer. It seems like implementing these programs requires a very careful balancing act, weighing the potential economic benefits against the potential social costs.
For sure. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. And it makes me think about another complex issue we've touched on: immigration. It seems like every country we've discussed is grappling with immigration in some form or another, whether it's internal migration or migration from other countries.
It's true, immigration is everywhere. Like in China, you've got this massive movement of people from rural areas to cities. And then in the UK, there's all this anxiety about immigration from other countries. It's a global phenomenon for sure.
Yeah, and it's often portrayed as this very divisive issue. Some people see it as a positive force, bringing in new skills, ideas, diversity. Others worry about its impact on jobs, culture, even national security.
It's interesting how polarized the debate often is, but like with so many of these issues, the reality is probably much more nuanced than those simple pro or anti-immigration arguments.
Exactly. The impacts of immigration can vary a lot, depending on things like the skills and education level of the immigrants, the economic conditions in the receiving country, and the policies in place to manage integration.
Right, so it's not a black and white issue. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. Each country has to find its own way to navigate these complexities, to address the concerns of its citizens, while also, recognizing the potential benefits that immigration can bring.
Absolutely. It requires a thoughtful approach, one that goes beyond, just simple slogans or fear-mongering. We need to understand the nuances, the complexities.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Yeah.
We've talked about structural adjustment programs, immigration, and, of course, the resource curse, which we saw playing out in both Nigeria and Russia. These are all really complicated issues with no easy solutions.
It's like each country is trying to solve a giant multidimensional puzzle. And the pieces of that puzzle are constantly changing.
Speaking of changing pieces, it seems like technology is playing a bigger and bigger role in all of this.
Oh, yeah. Technology is a game changer, no doubt. From China's tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent to the mobile banking revolution in Nigeria, technology is driving innovation, creating opportunities, and disrupting industries in a huge way.
I remember reading about how mobile banking has given millions of people in Africa access to financial services for the first time, people who never had access to traditional banks. It's amazing how technology can empower people and drive development.
It's a great example of how technology can leapfrog over traditional barriers and create entirely new possibilities. But we also have to remember that technology isn't a magic bullet. It can actually make inequality worse if access is uneven or if it's used to exploit workers or consumers.
So it's a powerful tool, but like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad. It's up to us as informed citizens and consumers to make sure it's being used responsibly and ethically.
I completely agree. And that brings us to another huge global challenge that's intertwined with all of this.
Yeah.
Climate change.
Oh, yeah, climate change. It's the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's impacting every country on the planet, but in different ways. How are these 5 countries responding to this challenge? I mean, what are they doing?
Well, their approaches are pretty diverse. China, as the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, is facing a lot of pressure to clean up its act. They've been investing heavily in renewable energy and setting ambitious targets for reducing emissions. But they still have a long way to go.
It's interesting how China is trying to position itself as a leader in clean energy technologies. It seems like they're trying to be at the forefront of the green revolution.
Yeah, it's a smart move, both economically and politically. But it also shows that they recognize they can't ignore the environmental consequences of their growth anymore.
What about the other countries? What are they doing about climate change?
Well, Mexico has made some progress in developing renewable energy sources, but they also have challenges with deforestation and water scarcity. Nigeria is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, like desertification and coastal erosion. They're working on adapting to those changes and developing more sustainable agriculture.
It sounds like climate change is adding a whole other layer of complexity to the economic and social challenges they're already dealing with.
It definitely is. It really underscores how interconnected all of these issues are. Climate change isn't just an environmental problem. It's an economic problem, a social problem, a security problem.
It's a reminder that we can't address these challenges in isolation. We need a more holistic approach that considers the connections between economic development, social well-being, and environmental sustainability.
I couldn't agree more. These are complex, multifaceted issues, and finding solutions requires collaboration, innovation, and a willingness to think outside the box.
And it requires engaged citizens who are informed about these issues and who are willing to hold their leaders accountable.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
But one key theme keeps coming up. These 5 countries are all at a crossroads.
Yeah, it's like they're facing this perfect storm of challenges and opportunities that will shape their futures for decades to come.
And their choices will have consequences not just for them, but for the whole world.
Okay, we've explored structural adjustment programs, immigration, the resource curse, technology, and climate change. I feel like we're starting to get a handle on these complex issues, but I'm sure there's still more to uncover.
There's always more to learn. And in the final part of our deep dives, we're going to take a closer look at some of the specific policies these countries are implementing and what the future might hold for them and for the world.
Can't wait to see where this journey takes us next. Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll wrap up our global exploration and consider the long-term implications of these economic and social shifts. Welcome back, everyone. We're in the home stretch now, the final part of our deep dive into the economic and social shifts happening in China, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and the UK.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? We've explored globalization's impact, the resource curse, demographic changes, a lot of complex stuff.
We have. And one thing that's been kind of a constant throughout all these discussions is the role of government. It seems like each country is tackling this question of how much the government should intervene in a very different way.
Yeah, it really is fascinating to see the different approaches. You've got China with its state-led capitalism, where the government's super involved in guiding the economy. And then you have the UK, which is, well, they're struggling with how to balance their long tradition of social welfare with the pressures of, globalization and austerity.
It's like they're all trying to find that sweet spot, that perfect balance between government control and free market forces.
Right. But finding that balance is way harder than it sounds. What works in one country might completely backfire in another. It depends on so many things, a country's history, their political system, their cultural values.
But one thing's for sure, government policies have a huge impact on people's everyday lives, whether it's through social programs, regulations, or even something as, I don't know, technical as setting interest rates.
Absolutely. It really highlights why it's so important for citizens to be informed and engaged. They need to understand these policies, hold their leaders accountable, and make their voices heard.
Speaking of choices and, well, challenges, from all the material we've gone through, what would you say is the biggest economic or social hurdle facing these 5 countries in the coming years?
Oh, wow, that's a tough one. There are so many. But I guess if I had to pick just one, I'd say it's the challenge of creating growth that's both inclusive and sustainable. It's not enough for economies to just get bigger. That growth has to benefit everyone, not just a select few. And it has to be done in a way that doesn't wreck the environment or use up all the resources.
So it's about more than just, GDP and those economic indicators. It's about creating a better future for everyone, both within these countries and for the world as a whole.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that economic progress, social well-being, and environmental sustainability, they're all connected. You can't address one without thinking about the others.
All right, so let's bring it all home. We've taken a deep dive into the unique economic and social landscapes of China, Mexico, Nigeria, Russia, and the UK. We've seen how they're each navigating globalization, dealing with things like the resource curse and shifting demographics, and grappling with the role of government in shaping their futures. What are some key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with from all this?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they've come away with a better understanding of just how complex these issues really are. There's no simple answers, no one-size-fits-all solutions. Every country has its own unique set of challenges and opportunities.
And those challenges and opportunities are all kind of intertwined, right? What happens in one part of the world can have a huge impact on what happens somewhere else.
Oh, absolutely. We live in a globalized world, whether we like it or not, and understanding those connections is more important now than ever.
I think we've also shown how important it is to, look beyond the headlines and really dig into these issues. It's easy to get caught up in those oversimplified stories we see in the media, but the reality is always much more nuanced.
It's about asking those tough questions, looking at things from different perspectives, and even being willing to question your own assumptions.
And at the end of the day, it's about realizing that we all have a role to play in shaping a better future. Whether it's through the choices we make as consumers, how we engage as citizens, or the organizations we support, we can all make a difference.
I couldn't agree more. It's been fantastic exploring these complex and important issues with you.
And with all of you listening, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe challenged some of your assumptions, and inspired you to keep learning about these global challenges.
What really stuck with you? What questions do you still have? Join the conversation on social media. Share your thoughts, connect with others, and let's keep this conversation going.
Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and, of course, keep diving deep.